to this session, Solving the Productivity Puzzle. I'll start with a quote to get us into the topic. The quote is, "Productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it is almost everything. A country's ability to improve its standard of living over time depends almost entirely on its ability to raise its output per worker." That was written in 1994 by Nobel laureate and Princeton professor Paul Krugman. And these words, of course, about 23 years later, still hold true. The productivity puzzle still has not been solved. Official statistics show us that there's been a notable slowdown in productivity growth since the onset of the global financial crisis, after an acceleration that we saw in the 1990s and the early 2000s. Just to give you some numbers, and then there's not going to be any more numbers during the whole session. In the US in 2015, for example, we saw that labor productivity increased by only 0.7%, in the Eurozone by 0.6%, and even in China, where we've seen very strong productivity growth in previous years, it came down to only 3.7%. And even what looks impressive on the Chinese side is actually not so impressive, as we will find out during the discussion. Aging demographics, slowdown in world trade, and also the impact of the 2008 financial crisis have all had their impact on productivity growth and will continue to play a role. In the next hour, I would like to discuss this fascinating topic in greater detail with my panel. I'm not sure whether we're going to solve the productivity puzzle within this next hour, but I guess we'll try really hard. We will look at why this matters, what needs to change, and also which role new technologies could play in tackling this issue. Let's do a quick introduction before we're diving right into the topic. Here we've got Min Ju, former Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. Min Ju has thought about the productivity puzzle for quite a while and foresees sustained falls in labor productivity that fail to make up for the rising numbers of retirees. He thinks that low growth will be a structural phenomenon and will continue for some time, and we'll hear more on why that's going to be the case. Next to him, we've got Tyler Cowen, with whom I shared a stage yesterday, professor of economics at George Mason University. Has also worked on productivity-related issues for a number of years and has focused a lot on, in particular, the human element. So we've seen that despite huge technological progress in the past couple of years, productivity growth has been slow. And one of the reasons for that, and Tyler will explain that in a couple of minutes, is the human factor or the human element. Next to him, we've got Joseph Luc Ngai. I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing your last name correct, but please correct me if I'm wrong. Managing partner of McKinsey's Greater China office. Joseph has worked on this issue both in China, but then also has published on productivity growth development in other major economies, like, for example, the US, and has come to interesting conclusions, some of which he will share with us soon. Then we've got Babur Ozden, founder and chief executive of Maana. Maana is a Palo Alto, California firm that is describing itself as a knowledge platform that increases profitability for industrial and oil and gas companies. I hope I got that right. You're serving companies like GE, Chevron, Maersk, Saudi Aramco, and help their engineers make better decisions in terms of making operational decisions with the help of big data and pattern recognition. One of the, I guess, possible approaches to tackling the human element that Tyler is going to talk a bit about. And then here on my left, I should have maybe introduced you straight from the beginning. In the beginning, Kim Jun, the chairman of Junzi Capital, an investment and technology firm based in China, who is going to talk a bit about the role that investors can play in terms of investing in the right kind of companies that will then move the productivity issue forward. Starting us off, I think I'll start with you, Min Ju. I hope that's fine. Your forecast for productivity growth is that it's going to be very low for next coming years. Excuse the shrewd question, but why does that matter? And if so, what should we do about it?
Well, the first issue is, I agree with you, the productivity growth actually dropped quite a bit. I think in 2007, in the emerging market, the growth was roughly 2.8%. In the advanced economy, also almost 1.3%. And nowadays, the emerging market dropped to 1.3, and the advanced economy dropped to 0.3. We talk about TFP, it's much lower than the labor productivity, which is a slightly different concept now. And looking forward, we expect to see productivity pick up a little bit about that, but not very much. For example, in the emerging market, probably we can go back to 1 to 1.2% in the next 5 years. Advanced economy probably go back to 0.5 to 0.7. So better than this period in the past 7 years, but still way lower compared with before crisis 2000 to 2007.
And why does that matter?
It doesn't matter because if you don't have productivities, you don't have a cake. And income distribution is such a big issue, number one. Number two, aging demographic change, also a big issue. We have more people getting retired. Who will support the Medicare? Who will support the Social Security? We all need those from productivities. So I think that's the key challenge you are facing today. So it's absolutely need the whole world working on those issues. So I'm so happy we have this forum talk this issue. I think it's fantastic. I hope we can solve these issues. We all probably will win the Nobel Prize. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that would be great. I would love that. Tyler, how is that with your work? You've focused a lot on the human factor and then drawn some conclusions on why it is so difficult to increase productivity. Do you want to elaborate a bit on that?
Keep in mind, throughout most of human history, productivity growth has been quite low. There's this special period after the Industrial Revolution where we take fossil fuels and powerful machines and electricity, and we do wonderful things with them for many decades. But what we can do with those technologies, it's not literally over, but it's coming to an end. And the question is, where will the next big breakthrough come? Our economies are more and more about services. So education, key issue, how much do students pay attention? It's the human element. Technology alone won't do it. Healthcare, you invent a new diabetes drug. Well, great, but 80% of the patients right now don't follow the regimen they're supposed to. Yeah. Government, is that more or less productive? Depends where you live, but at least some of you should be worried, myself included. So you add that all up, you then have what I call internet boosterism. The internet is not as powerful a technology as fossil fuels were. You look at Uber, one of the most famous internet companies. I'm a big fan, I use it. There was a study commissioned by Uber itself. What is the benefit per American from Uber in a given year? $20. Great, it's more than anything I've done, right? But $20 is actually not a big difference maker. So we're still waiting for internet, artificial intelligence, whatever's on your list of buzzwords. We're waiting for all that to kick in. Eventually it will, but not tomorrow, not the year after, and I'll say not 5 years from now.
Kinjun, how is that on the Chinese side? As I said before, China, of course, still has to play has to do a big catch-up, so to say. At the same time, we also see some of the issues that Minju mentioned with regards to slowing demographics, which could have an impact. How severe do you think is the issue in China?
In my opinion, this is a big challenge to us today, and we're looking at the contextual changes to productivity. This is not just the system, the institution, the demographic structure, also the industrial foundation. At this time, around whether we will be able to drive industrial growth through technology, I think there's a question mark on it. First of all, Professor Zhu said aging population needs social safety net and fiscal spending. So we have to fix this issue. But the most difficult is the incremental part. And from an economic point of view, there are two ways to do that. First of all, the productivity gain from technology, and this can be found in emerging industries. and the other is how we could use power to transform existing industries, legacy industries, to improve productivity. I mean, every innovation and productivity gain has to be coming from people. Second of all, in addition to people's change as well as the environmental change, we also need to define the collaborative partnership arrangement, which is truly global and truly transformative. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That was, I guess, an interesting point, and I'll come back to some of the points that you raised before. Just to finish off a little introduction round, how is that, Joseph, in other advanced economies, in Germany, in the UK, in Japan, and also is there a difference in terms of productivity growth between different industries? Because I guess that's something that you've also worked on in the past.
Sure. I think the first thing to note is that we recently did research around automation, right? And we came up with looking at thousands and thousands of job types and thousands of kind of, what's in the job, right? What's the content in the job, right? And we figured out that 50% of all jobs today, right? 50% of all jobs today, in terms of the work that is actually required, we think can be automated, right? And that's something that, again, is technically possible, right? I'll come back to a little bit of Professor Cowen's point around why isn't it done, right? What's the process by which, right, it can be, can be pervasive in the economy? Is a little bit around what I call today, 3/4 of productivity gains, right, are already with technology that exists. It's already out there, right? You can calculate it. You can already say that, okay, all those people who are out there doing this job type, right, can be either replaced or can be, can be condensed. The problem is that 3/4 of these are not being caught up to best practices, right? There are many, many reasons, human factors, corporations, inertia, right, cultural issues, right, that actually not unleashing the productivity, right? So on the one hand, I think this conference is all around the new things, right, the AI, all the things out there that is actually not done yet, robots, But that's 25% of productivity gains. 75% is already there today, but we're not using it. The question is why, how, and how to accelerate it, right? If you take a 20, 30-year time frame, no doubt in my mind that you'll be done. The question is why not 15? Why not 10? Right? And that is a little bit around, how we here can talk about it and how, companies, decision makers, business leaders, opinion leaders, right, can accelerate the trend of how we embrace it and how we start to use some of these technologies that already exist out there.
Babur, how is that? We just heard that new technologies, of which your company is deploying one, is only contributing to 25% of productivity growth or potential productivity growth. How is that? You're on the forefront, of course, of new technologies being deployed in order to help grow productivity at large industrial engineering firms. How optimistic are you when you see the uptake of Maana's technology in terms of this being something which could be then a greater force to solve or to tackle the underlying productivity problem?
I'm an entrepreneur. I have to be very positive. So we don't allow negativism in our. If you can't be an entrepreneur.
So maybe I'm asking the wrong guy here.
No, but the right guy. You're asking the question to the right guy. So I just want to share a number that we worked with together with Forrester Group. Just today, if there was a way, the world's largest 600 industrial companies in oil and gas, industrial manufacturing, logistics, and shipping could improve decision-making by 2.5 million people work at their payroll, at operational decision workflows, by 20% improvement in decision quality. It would add to collective bottom lines to those companies annually $1.3 trillion. So that's this kind of the market we and my competitors are going to create or unleash a productivity expectation using various techniques involving artificial intelligence. So in that space, we see the world one company at a time, naturally. That's the general market definition. And we're seeing more and more very large companies are actually acting on that to be able to find ways to help their people to improve the day-to-day decisions they make. So if you look at from an angle, from our point of view, companies' greatest assets is this finite number of decisions that people make every day. So a decision, a single decision is an asset. can you improve on that asset? Can you optimize that asset that becomes part of the company's productivity gain? So that's sort of our angle coming into the market.
Well, that's actually maybe a good opportunity for me to pose a follow-up question to Kim Jin. Is there a company similar to Maana in China that is looking at decision-making at large industrial companies and looking at harvesting data in order to change the way how people make decisions? Is there, like, have you seen an equivalent or something similar on the Chinese side?
有的. Yes, we have the similar company. In China, actually a lot, because improving productivity can be done by technologies, and it is the best way to improve the efficiency in making decisions. And we base on, a lot of companies are using big data to do that. The startup has very innovative management scheme in building their company, and they are exploring ways to have better cooperation and better decision-making mechanism. And they're using ways to inspire their people to have more motive in their daily work. And they're helping their people to make better decisions. So in the future, we will be seeing more managerial ways to address not only the efficiency problem, but also many other problems against the backdrop of the new era with AI. It addresses the issue of our behaviors. Besides the issue of behaviors, the design of managerial scheme will also impact other people.
When you said that there's like a couple of companies that offer something similar to Maana, like you as an investor, have you invested? Would you look at investing in these companies?
I've invested a lot of companies, and the majority of the companies that I've invested are similar to Maana. I would say more than 85%, they're this new model startups. They have a lot of innovations, not only in their products and services, but also in their managerial schemes. Some companies make robots, some collect big data, and some do post-production for theater. And they have a lot of innovations. And these innovations are not only based on technology, but they're also changing people's mindset. Everyone is actually conducted by their mindset. Thank you.
We can come back to in a little while. You mentioned robots. I just wanted to throw that to the floor, the question of, like, we are of course seeing a lot of new technologies these days. We're talking about self-driving and even flying cars. We're talking about AI. I was told that's actually something which has been around for 40 years. So actually maybe AI is not so new, at least the term. We're talking about virtual reality, robotics, algorithms. Could you, like, as my panel, give me an overview, like, what do you think is going to be is there going to be, like, the thing among those that I mentioned which will be the most effective in tackling productivity, lack of productivity growth?
Well, the relationship between technology and the productivity is not all clear. At least it's not linear. I would say that. I think there's two types of different technologies. One thing is like Mr. Ozden did. He helped industry to improve the efficiency. I call it digitalization, which really improved the productivity on the company level. China had the plan for the manufacturing 2025. It's really try to massively digitalize the traditional manufacturing. I think that will provide the drive force for the productivity increase in the industry, the manufacturing, even agriculture, a lot of things, automations, decision-making efficiency, logistic efficiencies, and all those things that helps. But this is just a study in the very degree, I think. But what we heard is more on the consumption side, right? If anyone come to Dalian the first time, you understand the seafood in Dalian is good. They say, hey, I want to have some seafood. You get a mobile phone, say, the best seafood in Dalian, immediately he will give you the name of a restaurant, right? And then immediately he will help you do the booking. It's very convenient. Does that improve the productivity?
Yeah,
Yes or no? It's increase your utility function,
Yeah.
right? You become much happier, easier, you get the best food quickly. But do you spend the time you save to produce something, or you just have another extra drink, mingle with your friends, right? So it really not all clear. But today, what we saw mushroomed up is on the consumption side. It's not transformed into the productivity yet. So I would say, when we talk about technology, particularly, and we talk about fourth industrial revolution, so we've got to be very careful, see whether those technology, artificial intelligence, all those things will be able to transform into the industry. I think those are most important. It makes us life easier, happier, improve our utility. But we need more company like Mr. Ozden and his company. We need more industry adapt to new technology. I think digitalization it really is a blue sea and for the future of technology.
Tyler, any thoughts on that?
This is a really simple point I'm going to make, but it's usually neglected in productivity debates. Think of GDP as just a huge mountain of stuff produced every year. It's enormously high, and to make a dent in the growth rate of that mountain is actually extraordinarily difficult. And if you take all the media articles you read about new technologies, if you simply read them and nod, and then divide by 5, or maybe sometimes divide by 10, you will come closer to the truth. So take what I think is the most promising driverless cars. There's still an issue, not for all of China. Can they drive on snow? How does the car react when a policeman makes a hand motion? How do the cars react when pedestrians try to game the cars? They jump out in front to get the car to stop. New teenage game. You can see it coming. And then you have to have consistent regulations across cities, counties, states, federal level, for insurers, judges, juries. I mean, it will happen. But when you think about all of the different human elements for the whole thing to come together, I'll say it again. Read those articles, nod your head, and divide by 5.
So you're not very positive on technology.
How's that,
I'm
Joseph,
far
for
more
you?
positive on technology.
Yeah, more positive, yeah.
I think that I'll use Min's example, right? I think yes, if we have an app, we find the best restaurant, we go there. Maybe that doesn't in itself, right, create a lot of productivity, right? But you know what, right? In the app, as I read the reviews, right, that restaurant actually has good quality food. Actually, that restaurant has very efficient service, right? What will happen then is that that restaurant in the front end of the street, who has been incredibly inefficient over time, but just because it paid the rent of that particular capital, right? That restaurant will go out of business over time if information actually gets around, right? So as I think about what will happen in the productive world where data, right, and information becomes a little bit more efficient, a bit more pervasive, right? What will happen is that the more inefficient part of the economy, right, hopefully, will still start filtering out, right? And you're left with players in there who are trying to give you better service, better quality, right, cheaper prices, and care a lot, right, around customer feedback, continuous improvement. And I really think what is happening here is I think it's the information flow that actually matters the most, right? Because with that, I think people are empowered, right? Companies that are very, very small but are extremely good, right, in today's world can become what we call a micro multinational. That was never possible before. Multinationals were huge companies that basically have distribution, have people all around the world. Today, a tiny company, right, somewhere in China, right, can serve the rest of the world. That is fantastic. That is a unleashing, right, of productivity, right? Now, obviously, to make a dent in GDP, there's still a lot more to be done, right? These micro multinationals, there need to be, hundreds of millions of them, right? But I do think that if I think about the power of the internet of today's, maybe not robotics, but somewhere in there, I think could be as powerful, right, as the previous few unleashes, right, of productivity gains that we've seen in the past. So I'm far more positive around what will happen in the next 20 years.
Oh, that sounds great. I guess, of course, you're an optimist too.
Yes, of course.
Like leaving aside that, of course, you're in the business, and so, of course, you might be skewed towards one of the technologies that I mentioned before. But is there any favorite that you have in terms of what you think is going to have the biggest impact on increasing productivity growth?
I mean, definitely.
So to maybe reframe that question, will in the end, will the solution be in companies or in many more companies deploying technologies like yours in order to get rid of the bad decision making, and in the end then with that increasing overall outcome?
Yeah, it's an adoption. It takes a while to adopt even a single customer and then the whole industry. The traditional adoption wave of the first early adopters and then the next wave of adopters, mass scale adopters and laggers that comes, and that applies to every technology product category adoption. So today we probably see somewhere between early adopters to the next wave, say in the US and some parts of Europe in the industrial digital transformation. But eventually, if it's working for one company, it should work for many companies. And the adoption rate goes fairly high. And once it's adopted, it starts not helping a single company, but it's changing an entire industry if most of its major players are actually using techniques similar to it. So when you change an industry, if you change an oil and gas industry, it's got a number of other industries serving it, logistics, infrastructure, and etc. Then it spreads to the whole other industries around it.
How long does it on average take for you to convince a customer to deploy your technology? Because of course it takes, you didn't, we had a pre-conversation where where I asked you, how much do you charge customers? And you were like, I think I can't tell you. But I guess, of course, it is a significant financial investment that your customers take.
So I would answer this question 3 years ago differently. Today, we find that most of our prospect customers are actually wanting to go digital transformation. 3 years ago, when we were a year-old company, I would have to sell the concept of digital transformation so that I can pitch my product. Today, my prospect customers in the market want digital transformation. They've done their homework. They know which vendors are in the game. So they come ready looking for a solution. So it's about a year sales cycle to get in.
Interesting. Yeah, I would like to just pose some more questions on what you think needs to change in order for us to address this before we open the floor to some questions from the audience, of which I hope there'll be many. Chin, just coming back to you, how is that on the Chinese side? You said change also involves changes in leadership and in management and in how management conducts its business in a company. Can you elaborate a bit on that? What kind of changes do you foresee in how Chinese businesses are run, but then also how global and international firms are run, and in how far is that different from today?
In my opinion, technologies can help a company to improve. I myself are not only investing in the new startups, but I'm also looking at the traditional companies that are using new technologies that are changing all the time. In the future, there will be more and more financial and capital tools, and these tools would be very essential to promote the globalization for these companies. In the past, many companies are self-developing the technologies and to use these technologies to improve their productivities. But now they can use capital to, say, acquire in a timely manner some other companies to help to improve whichever aspect of their company. Now the information is becoming more and more transparent. Globalization for Chinese company is no longer a lingering issue. The Chinese companies are very powerful in acquiring capabilities globally. There are three factors for Chinese companies to go abroad. First of all, they need to understand the role and the rules and regulations of industry. Second, legal issues, because China's legal framework is entirely different from those in other countries.
Number three, you need globalized globalized views and globalized talent, international talent, and you could use capital as a lever to participate in global markets. Another trend I would like to mention is when it comes to productivity gain, it has to be linked to globalization, especially in the integration of resources across industries. I'm very bullish on this because I have an incubator in Silicon Valley, which is used to incubate local indigenous companies.
是的。
Yes, American companies. And then those companies could be bought by listed public companies from China. And large companies are also building R&D centers around the world in order to save costs. For example, in East Coast, there are some companies from China working with MIT in establishing engineering labs and R&D labs to help them address the issue of internationalization. I mean, there's already an established pathway for large corporates to go global, and for the mini multinationals, maybe it will take more time. But I think for companies to operate across borders, there will be a clearer pathway and a quicker shortcut, so to speak.
And how is that coming back to this kind of management styles? When I was based in China for the German newspaper Bao Die Welt, I had the impression that was a couple of years ago. I got to know a lot of Chinese firms that were, well, I would say organized relatively straight, top down, not much deviation from the path, and also many ways that things were done a certain way and you wouldn't necessarily question that, which of course, when it comes to creativity and when it comes to developing new business ideas and also maybe then in the end increasing output is not so helpful. And how far do you see like these ideas that you mentioned from Silicon Valley impacting Chinese firms in terms of leadership style and in terms of thinking of new ways of doing business?
我觉得其实
I think the impact is quite huge. Take myself as an example. I've been working, I started my career in SOE, and I was a senior leader in one of the SOEs for 12 years. And then in 2010, I left the company and started my own business. And I felt really strongly that the mentality that you had in an SOE had to change when you are running your own business. So one big insight and discovery to me was that you need a team around you. Even if you are very strong, you need to find people who are more capable to help you, more capable in one area of expertise or one discipline at least. So for a leader, first you need to know your limitations, and you need to be tolerant towards others, and you can accept some of their shortcomings. So this is a test of their leadership capabilities. So I'm now a serial entrepreneur. This is my third startup. Compared with my first try, I really felt that not just the combination of capabilities and expertise is different, but also I'm combining it with values. So when you have the right values, you feel that the whole team is burning, and you can feel the passion and also the drive coming from the team leaders. And then the third element is the incentive scheme, like the stock option scheme. I think this together could be very useful for startups. You need to delegate not just powers, but also your financial gains, and then also how much room you could provide to your employees for them to grow and mature. So distribution is the key word, and for startups, leadership, technology, could be less of a barrier because many technologies will become open source. So what is the comparative point of difference would be the people.
I think you've been raising this interesting point in terms of how does behavior and collaboration and how do we interact with each other in companies, and how far does that play an impact or have an impact on productivity? Tyler, that's something you've worked on a lot as well, this whole question of like what is the workspace looking like? How are we interacting at work? What do you think needs to change there, given that in the end, the way that people work when it comes to offices, much of that hasn't really changed for the past couple of years?
Well, you've all heard some different perspectives.
我们已经从这个
Context and overarching framework. These people, they're in business. Business is doing great. They're creating value. It's amazing. But you look at, say, the American economy. More and more of it is healthcare, education, and government. I am not worried about business. You can tell positive stories about business all day long. Most of those stories will be true. You look at education, my area. We've had the internet now in its mature form well over 20 years. How much has it improved education? Maybe zero, maybe this much. You have the United States spends more on healthcare than any country in the world ever. And we had a new bill, Obamacare. Over the last 10 years, our mortality results have been disappointing. In many counties in the United States, actually people are dying younger. We can't stop them from abusing opioids, for instance. So productivity in healthcare is not doing well. The bad companies, they don't so much go out of business. Concentration ratios for hospitals are rising. Obesity is rising. Diabetes is a bigger problem. Again, government, I don't know how to measure its effectiveness, but I'm not convinced that all of the governments in the world are getting better right now. I think actually a lot of them are getting worse. So that's a big part of the economy. And if you look at that, you're going to be very pessimistic. You look at business, you're going to be optimistic. You add the two together and you get an And that's where we're at. You know, in the office and business, things are fine, but I think getting people to cooperate in healthcare, education, government is the huge problem. Right now, we're still failing.
And you also, I guess, mentioned this very important part of the economy, like the service sector, where if you take, for example, a hairdresser, like that's of course a very basic service, but there's of course questions to like how much you can actually upgrade functions like these in order to increase productivity and the amount of heads and hairs cut per day, right?
Sure.
Any ideas on because of course service productivity is quite an issue, given that also our economies changed to becoming more service focused. So of course, if productivity in that sector is not so high and we don't have many means to improve it, then of course the problem keeps growing.
I think there's some very long run, more than 20 years from now, where everything you read about in the media actually will come true, and it will make education work online or in hybrid forms. Schools that do not conform will disappear. Ultimately, even subsidies will not prop them up. You can Skype India for a diagnosis. A better version of Watson will work, not soon.
There is one here.
There will be ways of getting what you want in terms of pharmaceuticals at more reasonable prices. Hospitals finally will be forced to compete. All this will happen, but you think about the time frames and you look at past problems, like how long did it take to make electricity really effective, or for cars to really transform? It's like 40 years is what it takes to restructure your institutions for the things in the pipeline. So waiting is actually our best strategy. I know I sound gloomy. I'm not a pessimist. I think a lot of wonderful things are in the pipeline. People just have badly unrealistic expectations about how long a lot of it will take.
Well,
maybe that's, sorry.
If I may add, actually, the link between the professor and the business person is a structural reform issue. And usually, when you have a very viable micro, on the private sector, you should have a good macro situations, right? But obviously, when we pick the successful business person, it's a self-selection process. We don't see the not successful business person behind, right? So let's go back to professor's conclusion, macroly, it's not very good. So that's clearly a structure issue. International experience says, if you have a lower and a continuous slowing productivities, you have a structure issues. So that means economically, professor, you say, we're not in the production frontier, right? That's the whole thing. So what do? You introduce more market force, open up, and more educations, and more policy encouraging innovations, and the fiscal policies to more support the growth-oriented SMEs. So all those things will form the structure form, will bring those micro issues to the macro level. And so I think that's important. You disagree?
No,
Maybe that's actually the good point to bring you in.
I think that if we're here to talk about healthcare, education, government, we won't solve anything. I think, which is the first point. The first point is where the allocation of capital, right? The allocation of resources, right? In the state-owned capital, for example, even in China today, when you look at all the productive and highly innovative companies we see out there, none of them are actually state-owned, okay? And so when you actually think about it, right, the sectors you imagine, right, a tenured professor, right, is the most inefficient structure in the entire world. You can't be fired, right? How is that efficient? So when you think about all these structures, right, of course, if we pick the ones, right, that are, by definition, right, a little bit more, I would say state-owned, less efficient by design. There are other values behind it, right? I think that's actually one of the things that we can change, but it's painful, right? There are two more things. One, I think that we've got to overcome the fear of transition, right? One of the major problems of productivity, right? Why are companies not taking advantage of the 75% of improvement they can right now? Is because the displacement of people's job, okay? If there's a fear around, well, if that's going to bring less jobs, let's not do it, right? If that's going to make transitions of people who are not ready for it, it feels very painful, okay? I think most companies are not able to overcome the fear of that transition. We're not thinking about the displaced workers. We're not thinking about the people of the technology might actually fall on the side of not benefiting from it, right? This whole inequality, right, I think is a big detriment, right, towards how we can actually become more productive quicker, right? And the third one is where I think it's around leadership, right? I think you mentioned it quite a few times. Yeah. I think in companies today, there's a divide between the ones that actually get it, are moving very, very fast, and the ones, even the private sector, that are actually not moving, right, and are really lagging behind, right? And maybe the capital markets will take care of it, maybe not, right? But that's also another part of it, where I think the leaders who actually are getting it, to understand it, and can lead the change, right? I think that's scarce right now. Technology is there, the opportunity is there, but there isn't enough leadership.
How's that, Babur, with those companies that deploy your technology? Like, maybe you hear from them internally how it goes in terms of employees that are using the technology versus those that are not, and how far is there like a gap or a hurdle
what we
have
see,
to jump?
Yeah, what we see, two things. One is that, and I'm not aware, if it's there, I'm not aware that I don't think anyone is afraid laying off people when people needs to be laid off.
The employees are not afraid, or the executives are not afraid?
Management. So the thing that they're looking at it is that can I use certain things in my world technology to continuously reflect productivity to my financials? Because particularly the world's largest companies, at least publicly traded companies, have enjoyed the productivity gains throughout the 90s and early 2000s, which they got addicted to it, so they want to keep reflecting it into their financials. And there's the second, reasonably, increasingly in the industrial world, is the Kodak syndrome. They don't want to be the next Kodak. So they're looking around to see, because if you take today, like Alibaba or Amazon, disrupting significant logistics structures. So there are fears, and boardroom level fears and preparations, is there something out there not coming from my classical rivals, but in outside dynamics is coming my way. And if I don't do something, that would be, I won't be around for another decade. So those are the kind of two dynamics we see.
But of course, that's also more looking at the executive level rather than the average employee level. That could be the one that is finding huge changes to what is expected, and also finding that maybe they don't have the qualifications to deal with your platform.
And as he mentioned, the digital transformation in the industrial world starts at the boardroom level. It starts with the CEO, the board, and they devote hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to this transformation. And it's a multi-year journey. It requires that devotion, and its two primary drivers is to financial results, remain competitive, and remain relevant, and be in the business in the next decade or two.
I have many more questions, but I would like to, you want to add something? Go ahead.
I think the innovation of many companies do have fear. The fear comes from two sources. One source is innovation itself. The iteration cycle in China is very short because there is different stability and scale of the economic development. The new technology iteration cycle is very short. Now we talk about Internet Plus. I think it is actually Internet Plus punishment because we're now fully prepared. Staff are afraid of their job being taken away. And executives are not well prepared to do innovation when their technology is being iterated. They are afraid of the coming of the risk, and the life circle of the innovation cannot be controlled by these bosses or executives. And they're also afraid of the loss of business opportunities. So these are the issues they have to deal with. For SOEs, China is quite unique. The system has its unique task. Government has specific resources allocation for SOEs, so I don't know how much of a concern of this for them. But when new technology emerges, the cross-disciplinary application has changed many business models. And these business models are here to stay in the market, so this is what they worry about. Thank you.
I think we've heard a wide range of thoughts, ideas, suggestions. I would want to open this to the panel, to the floor, sorry. And please state your name. And do we have mics, or there's mics coming? Here first, lady here. And also maybe state who you would want your question to answer.
Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. My name is Svenja Falk. I work with Accenture. And I would like to ask a question to the economists. There has been a lot of debate that the productivity puzzle ultimately is nothing more than a measurement problem. And many institutions, both companies and multilateral organizations, are now trying to come up with methodologies and approaches to measure digital value in the economy. I would be very interested in how you assess those attempts and whether you feel that this will help us to solve the puzzle. Thank you.
Well, that's, let me start. You are real economists, so I will start so they probably can. Indeed, the measurements is a big issue, obviously, particularly when the whole world moving to the service sector. The whole world become lighter now, because from the advanced economy to emerging market, the service sector really picked up. And if you're looking for the US in the past 8 years since the financial crisis, most of the job created is in the service sector. Yeah, hospitalities and all those things. But we don't have a good measure on the service productivities. I think that's the key areas. We really need to focus on those issues, see whether we'll be able to do that. And I think that's the first issues. The second issue is productivity is very much associated with investments, with the human capitals. And we observe in the past 8 years, investments really slowed down because demographic issues. The labor supply also slowed down. So that comes to the fundamental issues, whether productivity is a pure independence or is an equation of the capital and the labor. So we need to focus on those issues, understand the linkage between the productivity and the labor force, and also capital growth and the quality of the capital and the labor force. I think that's the second area we need working on it. But we can use this measurements issue to be an excuse, say, because the measurement issue, maybe productivity is not so low. But the real life is the growth is so low, right? Regardless, we say that. And within the growth, the investments growth and the labor supply growth even lower. So we give even big share to the productivity growth. So in that sense, we should not overestimate the importance of productivity in terms of growth.
Charlie, do you want to chime in?
The biggest measurement problem is simply a lot of the service sector. There's inefficient third-party or government payment, and we value that at expenditure. So probably we measure that we're doing better than we actually are. The real problem's actually worse. Some people have this view there's a mysterious gain to the internet not being picked up in GDP. There are now numerous studies. It doesn't seem to be that large. Most of the internet is monetized one way or another. You buy things on Amazon, it's in GDP. You want access to the internet, you buy a smartphone, that's in GDP. The quality of leisure time has gone up. That's not properly measured in GDP. But overall, I think the problem is worse than it looks in the numbers, somewhat.
Could we get the mic here?
Hello, thank you. Hossein Kasai, I'm the CEO of a software company. So my question is also to the economists, and it's around living standards. Because the panel discussion in summary, in some parts, is around how emerging technologies can help not just productivity, but living standards. And of the tech examples, we mentioned the ones that increase utility for a consumer, like the app ordering food and so on, as well as knowledge-based sharing information that can augment labor and create productivity. But is there not a whole category of things such as machinery that automates labor and increase the returns to capital and therefore relatively decrease the returns to, or reduce the relative returns to labor? And as a result, the living standards for the average worker would go down as productivity goes up. So the question is, with regard to how emerging technologies can help increase productivity, is it perfectly aligned, and should we equate that to increasing living standards, or are these two at times in conflict?
Yeah, it's a very good, very good question. And, but let's move into the distribution issues. The increasing part of the productivity belong to whom? Belong to laborers, belong to capitals, belong to patents. Now in those days, more and more belong to patents, right? There's also a big argument whether we should have a legal framework to protect those patents. The global trends in the past 20 years, regardless of advanced economy, emerging market, labor wage share in GDP continuously on downside, which is a serious issue. In the advanced economy, in the past 30 years, dropped roughly 10 percentage points. And in the emerging market, dropped 6 percentage points. So that means labor share is getting less and less of a productivity gainings. So I think that's a very important perspective. We need to rethink about redistribution of policy and the fiscal policy. We need to clearly define, because productivity today is more associated with technology, we think about labor contribution, capital contribution, and patent technology contributions, and distribute those assets among those owners in a fair way.
Joseph, you were nodding.
No, I absolutely agree. I think that's why I was saying before that part of what has not been discussed in this productivity is what happens to society, right? And I think that's also where I totally agree. I think that the disappointment, in the last 20 years, right, is that the gains of progress, right, has not been shared, right? And I think that's also where, if you continue with his company, if you continue with her investments, right, you're going to see the gains even more disproportionately going towards the companies that are moving well ahead, and to some sectors that are behind. And for workers, right, for the people who actually can operate these AI and these machines and the robots, and the ones who are being displaced, right? I think that's where maybe we are in a world where that's inevitable, right? Maybe we will continue to think about how to redistribute through government policy, taxes, and so on and so forth. But back to your first question, right? In the last 50 years, basically we had population or working population gains being half of the total GDP growth, and the other half of GDP growth being from productivity, right? Over the next 50 years, there'll be no more working population growth, okay? So we sit there and look at this pie and say, well, if we grow it, it's not gonna be fair to those people, but not growing it is not an option, right? And that's where I think it's a very difficult task, but I think that, it's the reality that we're facing.
We can't hold back on robots or AI, but the return to land is way too high, and that we can fix.
Mm-hmm.
We've got time for one last question. Maybe there in the back. And please also state who you want to answer your question.
This is Kopazar from Koç Holding. We have roughly 100,000 employees in Turkey, and one of the agenda items was the premature deindustrialization. it wasn't covered, so I'm wondering your opinions about what the emerging nations can do to avoid premature deindustrialization.
Wow, that's a good question. It's a very
They
good
can't.
question.
It's my answer.
Yeah, you go ahead.
No, that's it. That was it.
I think that's. You did. Okay. Yeah, fantastic, Professor. I think this is a really a good key issue, because when technology in the early stages, right, we're associated with bubbles, irregularities, all those issues, and how do you pose the regulations is a serious issue. You have to regulate the whole thing, right? You cannot let it go without a certain framework and a rule. But I would say the basic thing, before you put into the regulations, enhance the market mechanism. Introduce the play field, so let the competition go. So I think that's the most important thing. I think that's the number one. And that's the number two, is when you impose the regulation, you always be very, very careful, not sort of stop and sort of put the layer to slow down the process, rather than put a safety cushion to guide the whole industry, because we really don't know where is the futures. So I think to the third area, to reach that goal, it's absolutely important to have the communication between the business leader and the regulator and the authorities, and also for the engineers and the scientists. I think because when the people working together, they will figure out what is the future regulatory framework. Yeah, this is an absolutely important issue.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot also to my panel. I think at least it's now to me to wrap it up. I think we've found out that there's some pessimists here on the stage, some optimists, some that are neutral. We've learned that it's going to take another, you said, around 40 years before we see some of the technologies actually having a strong impact on productivity growth. I think we have managed to point out some important aspects of the topic. Of course, we didn't really solve the productivity puzzle, but that was also maybe not intended for this session. Thanks a lot for coming onto the stage and for taking my questions. Yeah, and I look forward to collaborating further. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.